The offer, however, of again recurring to arms was not lost upon Fouché. The traitor was well known that if the emperor showed himself under the critical circumstances in which we were placed, the army and the whole population would greet his appearance with transports of joy. This prince had not failed to perceive the snares that had been thrown in his way. A sense of indignation and of personal danger might drive him to some desperate measure. Fouché determined to allay his anger and wrote to the Minister of Marine in the following letters. Paris, 28th of June, 1815. Monsieur le Duc, great delays having occurred since the demand for passports on behalf of Napoleon and the existing circumstances giving reason to apprehend danger for his personal safety, we have resolved to consider Article 5 of our decree of the 26th of this month as of non-effect. The frigates are accordingly placed at Napoleon's disposal. Nothing can any longer obstruct his departure. The interest of the state and his own well-being imperiously require that he should depart immediately after you shall have notified to him our determination. Count Merlin is to join you on this mission. The Duke of Otranto, Count Carnot, Count Grenier, Baron Quinet, Calincourt, Duke of Vicenza. P.S. It is of importance that you proceed to Malmaison immediately. On the receipt of this order, Count Merlin is about to call upon you. It might be supposed from this letter that the emperor had only to enter upon his journey, but the Duke of Otranto, who labored in each of his dispatches to represent him as undecided and even opposed to the project of quitting Paris, was far from intending that he should yet take his departure. The Minister of Marine shall now lay the artifice open to our view. To the President of the Commission of Government, Paris, 29th of June, 2 o'clock in the morning. President, it is now 2 o'clock in the morning, and Mr. Merlin does not make his appearance. I do not even know when he is to arrive, since it has not been possible to find him. It appears from the proscript of your dispatch of yesterday that I am only to go to Malmaison in his company. There is, however, no time to be lost in this state of things. Therefore, I request you will let me know whether or not I am to wait for Mr. Merlin ere I notify your orders to Napoleon. Decree. The commission which the provisional government was sending to the allied sovereigns had taken the road towards Alsace, where it hoped to find them, and the Anglo-Prussian army was accelerating its march towards the capital. That army had got the start of the Allies and was debouching under the walls of Paris. It became necessary to come to an understanding with it. Fouché was unable to complete his treachery. Events were hastening too rapidly to a close. The Anglo-Prussians already occupied part of the country along the Seine. It was doubtful whether the emperor could escape. Fouché substituted Count Boulet to Merlin, and the Minister of Marine was at last enabled to hurry off to Malmaison and announced that the departure was now free from obstacles, as the passports had been set on the preceding day by Fouché, who added that the English government would probably direct vessels to cruise before Rochefort with the passes which he had demanded of Lord Wellington, intimating to him at the same time that the emperor was on his way to that port. Fouché had unquestionably other objects in view when he made this demand of the English. The emperor had not commissioned him to do so. He had merely applied for French passports. It is probable that Fouché had already received a reply from the English army, and that he had betrayed as great a want of candor towards Lord Wellington when he pretended to facilitate the emperor's departure. He was placing himself between two fires, whilst he still imagined that he could conceal his underhand maneuvers. The Minister of Marine did not fail to perform his duty with all the latitude which had been allowed to him. He even went so far as to say, I have brought with me the order for the frigates for the purpose of their only receiving it through you, and of preventing all supposition that they might have received another order to cancel the present one. He took leave of the emperor and returned to Paris. Monsieur de Lavalette also came to Malmaison and brought to the emperor the orders that might be required for the postmasters on the two roads leading to Rochefort through the provinces of Berry and Poitou. All the individuals who followed the emperor's fate were assembled at Malmaison. Many others had come to take leave. Princess Hortense was there with several ladies of her household. The emperor sent them off with the rest of her attendants. He embraced everyone and spoke in affectionate terms to each. The officers of his guard were anxious to take leave of him. He received and embraced them. All shed tears of grief at parting from him. Previously to relating what happened to the emperor after his departure at Malmaison, It will not be deemed superfluous that I should present the following observations. It has been seen in the course of this work with what eagerness everyone deserted their prince at the time of his first abdication, and how they hurried back to Paris for the purpose of assuming a new position under the patronage of their respective friends. This case was the same on the present occasion. A crowd of administrators, of officers of all ranks, were desirous of following their old leader, but Fouché, who envied the very feelings of those whose fortune was secured to them by the emperor, had labored to spread the seeds of defection amongst us. Some were called away to the functions with which they had been invested. Others were deceived by false hopes of promotion or of personal safety. Those with attachment for the emperor gradually cooled. Each one found a motive for withdrawing offers of service which had not been solicited of them. Even the unfortunate La Baudoyer recoiled at the moment of departure. The emperor waited in vain to bring him away. He had allowed himself to be seduced by false assurances that he would not be molested. He remained in Paris and fell a victim to his credulity and his confidence in some officious friends. This misfortune is the work of those who, whilst they pretended attachment to the emperor, were not ashamed to come to Malmaison for the purpose of shaking the resolution of the small number of persons who were linking their fate to their fallen chief. Monsieur de Blanc exerted every means to seduce Montholon, whilst he kept feeding the emperor's hopes. As well might he have stabbed him on the spot. Le Baudoyer allowed himself to be persuaded by him, and his life paid the forfeit of his credulity. Chapter 10. The emperor was almost alone at Malmaison when a young merchant arrived there in utmost haste to inform him that he'd seen from the plain of Saint-Denis a very large body of the enemy's cavalry descending on the Seine and appearing to move upon Malmaison. This young man entreated him to depart as soon as possible. The emperor felt grateful for this mark of interest, returned him thanks, and ordered up the carriages. His suite was divided into two parties. The first consisted of several carriages in which were Madame Bertrand and her children, Monsieur and Madame de Montholon with their child, Monsieur de las Casas and his son, as well as several orderly officers who had requested leave to accompany the emperor. All those carriages were to take the road to Orleans, pass by Châteauroux, and reach Rochefort on the appointed day. The second convoy consisted of a single simmer calash containing the emperor, General Bertrand, and General Becker, and myself. The emperor's valet was on the calash box, and a courier proceeded half a league before us in order that we might find horses in readiness on our arrival at every post station. The emperor was dressed like ourselves in a plain frock without any mark of distinction. We carried no luggage with us, and the calash had no appearance of being intended for a long journey. We were merely provided with every kind of arms. The emperor's effects were in another carriage containing two seats. General Gourgaud was in this carriage, which kept at a distance of 2 hours' journey behind us. All the carriages came up to the portico of the palace, with the exception of the calash, which remained in the courtyard that divides the castle from the kitchens. The emperor overtook it with us through the winding walks of the garden, whilst the other persons I have mentioned stepped into the carriages drawn up under the portico. The calash was the first to depart through one of the walks of the park, as it was less conspicuous in appearance than the others. The public attention was not directed to it, but was fixed on the carriages of the other convoy, to which the picket stationed at the iron gate opening on the high road presented arms under the impression that the emperor was in one of them. It had not discovered that he had already passed. It will soon be seen that this measure of precaution turned out to be a fortunate idea. The emperor's calash repaired to Roquencourt by the Bois du Boutard without passing through Versailles, which was on its left, and proceeded to Saint-Cyr, where it entered the road of Chartres. We reached Rambouillet at nightfall. Instead of passing through the town, we drove up the Grand Avenue of the castle, where the emperor slept that night, and at an early hour the next morning we quitted it by the avenue leading to the park gate beyond the town on the road to Chartres. We proceeded undiscovered as far as Châteaudun, where the postmistress hastened up to the carriage door to the utmost anxiety to inquire if we came from Paris, and if there was any truth in the report that another accident had happened to the emperor. She had scarcely uttered this question when she recognized him, and without saying a word raised her eyes to heaven and returned home bathed in tears. We proceeded without stopping through Vendôme as far as Tours, where we arrived In the nighttime, the emperor wished to see the prefect, and the carriage accordingly stopped on quitting the town by the road of Poitiers. I proceeded in search of that administrator, a man of excellent character. The emperor was moreover anxious to see and put questions to him. He wished to know what was taking place in the country, because if Fouché had meditated to procure his arrest on the road, it would have been known at Tours that someone had passed through the town with an equivocal mission. If, on the other hand, his satellites were following us, the prefect would stop them, or at least give us timely information of their approach. The emperor conversed for a quarter of an hour with the prefect, after which we proceeded on our journey towards Poitiers. The heat was excessive, and we stopped at the post house until the air had grown cooler. The emperor selected that halting place in preference of any other, because the post house was outside the town. We were not recognized and enjoyed undisturbed repose until 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when we set off for Niort, at which place we had not intended to stop, but a trifling altercation we had at Saint Maxin occasioned us some alarm. We were unwilling to expose ourselves to shipwreck in that very harbor. We therefore passed the night in that town. The adventure in which our alarm had originated was as follows. On arriving at Saint Maxin, within 5 or 6 leagues of Niort, we saw a crowd of people in the square of the town hall. The National Guard is upon the alert since the renewal of the disturbance in La Vendée. It stopped our calash and demanded our passports. General Becker replied in his capacity of commissioner from the government and exhibited his passports as well as the orders entrusted to him. No mention was therein made of the emperor. Difficulties were thrown in the way, which his firmness succeeded in overcoming, and we continued our journey. But there is no doubt that General Bertrand or I should otherwise have been compelled to answer for ourselves. We had necessarily also the emperor must infallibly have been recognized, as Niort was at the same time a place of residence of a prefect and one of the western points at which troops were assembled for the purpose of opposing the insurrection of La Vendée. We were glad to stop in that town with the view of ascertaining what was taking place in the vicinity. Night had just set in when we arrived. The emperor alighted at the post house, where he sent for the general in command of the town, as well as the prefect. He then proceeded to the prefect's residence, at which he passed the night, as well as the following day. The report of his arrival became public. From an early hour in the morning, a considerable crowd obstructed the approach to the hotel of the prefecture, where it remained the whole day. The officers, the troops, and the principal citizens testified the same degree of eagerness and felt the same regret at seeing the emperor departing. The prince was no doubt distressed at being unable to avail himself of this opportunity of taking advantage of the general enthusiasm. General Becker reported it to the provisional government. I am ignorant of the contents of his report, but it gave rise to the 2 following letters, which cannot fail to suggest deep reflections. Paris, 4th of July, 1815. Minister Marine, the commission sends you a copy of the letter it has written to General Becker. It is the wish of the commission that you should transmit the necessary instructions to Rochefort in order that military aid may be furnished to General Becker, as well as any other assistance he may require towards the accomplishment of its missions. You will find enclosed the letter addressed to General Becker, the ministers of the Interior and of War. Prize that the courier you dispatch will take charge of the instructions they have to issue in reference to the same object. The Duke of Otranto, Carnot, Count Grenier, Quinet, and Caulaincourt. Paris, 4th of July, 1815. General Becker, the commission of government has received the letter you have written to it from Niort under the date of the 2nd of July. Napoleon must embark without delay. The success of the negotiations mainly depends upon the positive assurance the Allied powers wish to receive of his actual embarkation, and you are not aware to what extent the safety and repose of the state are compromised by this procrastination. Had Napoleon taken his departure immediately, we have before us a report from the maritime prefect of Rochefort stating that there was a possibility of succeeding on the 29th. The commission therefore places the person of Napoleon under your responsibility. You must employ every measure of coercion you may deem necessary without failing in the respect due to him. Accelerate his arrival at Rochefort and make him instantly embark. As to his offer of services, our duties towards France and our engagements towards foreign powers do not allow us to accept of them, and you must no longer mention the matter to us. Lastly, the commission conceives it to be inexpedient that Napoleon should communicate with the English squadron. It cannot grant the permission which is asked on that subject. Duke of Otranto. 2 other documents of this extraordinary negotiation are of sufficient importance to be recorded. Those whom they concern will perhaps be pleased to clear up whatever obscurity may be found in them. The Maritime Prefect to General Becker, Rochefort, 1st of July. General, the roadstead of Lille-Dax is closely blockaded since the 27th of June by an English squadron consisting of a line of battleship, 2 frigates, 2 corvettes, and a brig. The division, which had stood out to sea until the 27th and extended from the entrance of the river running to Bordeaux to the Sable, has concentrated itself since that period, keeps at a distance of 2 leagues from the coast, right across the roadstead, and comes up every evening to Basque Roads for the purpose of watching us, so that it is utterly impossible for our 2 frigates to attempt sailing whilst the enemy retains his present position. That said division, which has only made its appearance on our coast since the early part of June, had constantly stood out to sea until the 27th, and I cannot but suppose that there is an extraordinary motive for this change in its maneuvers. It would appear to me to be highly dangerous for the safety of our frigates, and of what they are to take on board, that they should attempt to force their way out. It would be proper to wait for a favorable opportunity which cannot offer for a long time to come during the present season, when the English forces which blockade us and keep up at the same time a regular correspondence by means of vessels placed at stated distances with the squadrons permanently stationed on the coast of La Vendée, afford no opportunity of succeeding in the attempt to order off our vessels from Lille-Dax. They cannot quit that anchorage for the open sea without being intercepted by the cruisers, which are in superior strength. I am so much broken down in health for the last week that it is impossible for me to proceed to join you. I am afflicted with a fever which has not left me for the last 3 days, but Monsieur de Keringal, the military commander, a man of honor and entitled to all your confidence, will take his departure in an hour hence. He will afford you such details as may induce you to adopt some positive determination in the critical circumstances in which we are placed. Count Bonnefou. To the Minister of Marine, Rochefort, 4th of July, 1815. Monseigneur, I have the honor to report to your excellency that Napoleon arrived yesterday at Rochefort with the suite which accompanies him at 9 o'clock in the morning. The frigates were in readiness, but the English cruisers, consisting of 2 ships of the line, 2 frigates, 2 corvettes, and a small vessel, blockaded the roadstead and every kind of passage from Gironde to La Rochelle. To that there is no hope of escaping without being seen or forcing a way through. The august personage, whom the French nation has taken under its protection, has made all his arrangements for departure. The intentions of the commission and your excellency's orders shall be executed in every respect. As far as I'm concerned, his majesty is and shall be treated with the consideration and respect due to his situation and to the crown which once encircled his brows. I am so much oppressed with business and difficulties of every kind that it would be impossible for me to enter into details. I request you, Monseigneur, to receive my best apologies and to accept assurances. The Maritime Prefect, Count Bonnefou. What was the real object of all those proceedings? Why prescribe coercive measures for the purpose of compelling the embarkation of a man who is anxious to take departure? What inconvenience could there exist in his communicating with the English squadron? What had Mr. de Keringal to do in all this? What arrangements had he to make? What motives, in short, had the Maritime Prefect in view when he exaggerated the enemy's forces which kept watching the harbor? Why did he fancy the existence of a squadron at a place where only 1 ship was to be found? For we who were at Rochefort knew what credit we should give to the assertions respecting that display of forces which he was so over anxious to create. The truth may, besides, be discovered by a reference to Captain Maitland's narrative. That formidable squadron consisted of the Bellerophon only. The 2 brigs which were in her company had been set on a detached service several days before, and the captain was so much at a loss that he was under the necessity of making use of his boat to forward the dispatch to Quiberon Bay. What was the object of all those measures, those journeys to and fro, those reports? The sequel will explain it. Whilst all were in this state of bustle about him, the emperor was preparing to proceed on his journey. He was desirous of prosecuting, as he had begun it, but the troops at Niort so earnestly requested to be allowed to supply him with an escort that he could not resist their repeated entreaties. He took his departure with a picket of light cavalry and reached Rochefort at 9 o'clock in the morning of the 3rd of July. He alighted at the hotel of the Maritime Prefect and waited there for the carriages which had proceeded through the province of Berry. They had met at Saintes with an accident which might have been attended with serious consequences had it not been for the proper feeling displayed by the authorities of that town. We were the more surprised at it as along the whole road from Paris to Rochefort respect had been paid to the Emperor's incognito, although we could have no doubt of his having been recognized, particularly in the town of Niort. He had been treated everywhere with marks of the liveliest interest and of the most respectful consideration. Why did it happen otherwise at Saintes? We never could succeed in ascertaining the cause with any degree of accuracy, and could merely indulge in conjectures on the subject. Prince Joseph had, on his departure from Paris, taken the road to Bordeaux with the intention of embarking for America. He overtook the convoy on the road and felt desirous of taking a farewell leave of the Emperor. His carriages, as well as those of the Emperor, were stopped on their arrival at Saintes. They were conducted to the municipality under the pretext of examining the travelers and taking back the millions they were carrying away, a clear proof that scouts had been sent in that direction. Certain expressions were overheard which indicated that the Emperor was sought for, and Prince Joseph was stopped in a very uncourteous manner. He was taken to the mayor, who demanded his name. "Sir," replied the prince, "I travel under such a name which is inserted in my passport, but I am Prince Joseph, the Emperor's brother. You may deal with me as you think proper." The mayor was all attention from that moment and paid every mark of respect to Joseph. He told him that the whole town had been set in motion by one of the bodyguards named Montfort or Dufour, but that he would do all in his power to restore order and to get in readiness the carriages which were just on the point of undergoing examination. He succeeded accordingly. The convoy continued its journey and was escorted by the gendarmerie as far as Rochefort. I again availed myself of the deference which the officers of that corps still retained for me, my person being very familiar to them, and asked how the disturbance at Saintes had originated without their being apprised of it. What they told me confirmed my previous opinion that someone whose name I subsequently ascertained had followed the traces of the Emperor all the way from Malmaison with a view to bring him into trouble, and he was certainly not the only one engaged on such an errand. Fortunately, the assassin mistook the carriages. He supposed that the most elegant were those applied to the Emperor's personal use and had accordingly kept up with them. Another wretch, however, of the same stamp, was not deceived by our humble equipage. He followed us with some of his abettors and never ceased watching a favorable opportunity for murdering us. He is now loaded with honors. Much good may he derive from them. It has been seen that these attempts did not take me by surprise. I knew, besides, that Fouché had set M. de Vie at liberty on the eve of the Emperor's departure, and it will be recollected that this was the same man who had been directed to organize a civil war in the south at the period of the 20th of March. I was aware that on the return from the island of Elba he had used every endeavor to find out some desperado who he might send to poignard the Emperor. The provisional government had gone a step further. It had dispatched agents to the coast and prepared the means of carrying off the Emperor, at least of preventing his eluding the vigilance of the English cruisers. Baron Richard, among others, was employed in setting every kind of plot on foot. He was an old conventionalist and had been appointed prefect of the Upper Garonne and of the Lower Charente in the days of the Empire, expelled from his situation as a regicide by Louis XVIII. He had solicited and obtained in 1815 another prefecture, that of the Department of Finistère, from whence he was soon dismissed in consequence of his extraordinary conduct in the discharge of his new functions. Ever since that dismissal, he followed the Emperor everywhere in order to be reinstated into favor at the Champ de Mai and during the ceremony which took place immediately afterwards in the gallery of the Louvre. He was seen to station himself amongst the electors of the Department of the Upper Garonne in hopes of obtaining some condescending expressions from the monarch. Deceived in his expectations, Richard was walking the streets of Paris without any employment at the time of the formation of the Commission of the Government, presided by his friend, the Duke of Otranto. Richard's condition altered from that moment to his manifest advantage. He was a discontented man, and then governing powers, flattering himself, not without just grounds, that they would render him ungrateful for former services. They sent him on a mission to follow the emperor, whose route had been traced out by themselves, and they directed Richard to watch him and to report his movements when he should have arrived at Rochefort. By this means, they had it in their power to seize him as soon as the presence of the foreign troops in Paris should render unavailing any opposition that might have sprung from the enthusiasm still created by the emperor's painful situation. Accordingly, the Commission of Government sent Richard to his old prefecture of the Lower Charente, and he was already installed there sometime, spreading amongst the newspapers the account of the nautical evolutions he had performed for the purpose of watching the Emperor Napoleon when the latter embarked on board the Bellerophon. This explains the source of the anonymous advice which Captain Maitland received whilst on board ship, and to which he refers into his narrative published in 1826. The Moniteur likewise informs us by the contents of a letter written on the 15th of July, 1815, by Monsieur Bonfou, the maritime prefect of Rochefort, that Monsieur Richard, prefect of the Lower Charente, had embarked in a boat with him for the purpose of supplying the chasm in the reports transmitted from the roadstead on the 14th. If there could exist any doubt of the secret mission given to Monsieur Richard by the Commission of Government, it would be asked how it happened that on the 14th of July he had already been several days installed as prefect at Rochefort, whilst the king had only nominated him to that prefecture by his ordinance of the 14th of July, inserted in the Moniteur of the 17th. It would further be asked if the question were not already explained by the treachery of which Richard had been made the instrument, how he came to be again appointed by the king on that particular occasion to a prefecture of which his majesty had dispossessed him a few months before, as having been one of those who voted the death of Louis XVI. Is it proper to add that the prescription which extended in 1816 to all such voters did not reach Mr. Richard, who was the only exception to it? The emperor learned on reaching Rochefort the 2 days before an English cruiser had made its appearance in the afternoon close to the entrance of Charente. It consisted of a single man-of-war and a corvette. Had it not been for the difficulties thrown by Fouché in our way, we might have set sail previously to its coming into sight. The carriages which had taken the road through the province of Berry had successfully arrived at Rochefort. The emperor was only intent upon his departure, which he was desirous of effecting without loss of time. He could not suppose that the least opposition would be offered to his voyage to America, and he so confidently indulged in the idea of establishing himself in that part of the world that he had already made choices of horses and other objects calculated to promote his comfort in his new existence. They were on their way to the coast by easy journeys and were to be shipped in any port where a vessel could be freighted to convey them. A regiment of marine artillery was quartered at Rochefort. A regiment of sailors was encamped at Lille docks in Rochefort Road. 1,500 National Guards were at La Rochelle. New York was occupied by a corps of cavalry, and there were about 3,000 men of the gendarmerie, horse and foot soldiers in the vicinity of that town. The greater part of their officers and subalterns had served under my orders and had received their appointments from me. General Clausel was at Bordeaux with some regiments of infantry under his command. All these troops transmitted the emperor the expression of their regret and devoted attachment. Personal services were tendered to him. Offers were made to follow his fate. There was not a military man within a circumference of 10 leagues who did not hasten to take leave of him. The same sentiments were manifested by the population of Rochefort. They remained stationary under the windows of the emperor, who was sometimes obliged to present himself in order to gratify their impatient eagerness to see them. As often as he appeared, he was greeted with as much respect as he had triumphed over all of his enemies. Rochefort is one of the cities to the healthiness of which the emperor had most contributed in a pecuniary point of view. He had never ceased during a long series of years to direct the labors requisite for drying up the marshes by which it is surrounded, and to cause the erection of works calculated to promote its internal improvement. All these undertakings had been crowned with success. The inhabitants of Rochefort were grateful for his attentions and felt no apprehension of manifesting their sentiments. I believe that every inhabitant, without a single exception, participated in our feelings. The emperor was desirous of embarking immediately on his arrival at Rochefort, but the naval officers represented to him that they required some days to put on board the articles he brought with him, and were under the necessity of watching for a favorable wind. He took up his residence at the maritime prefecture of the town, and remained there until the 8th of July, when everything was in readiness for his embarkation. He had been visited from all quarters. Everyone made offers of service to him. He declined those offers, observing that if he were to accept any of them, such an act on his part would serve as a pretext for the enemy to oppress France. He had beheld the public mind so much deceived by the impression of his being the only obstacle to general happiness that he was desirous of setting sail as soon as possible. He embraced all his old companions in arms and proceeded to embark on the right bank of the mouth of the Charente, near a fort which, to the best of my recollection, is called the Castle of Ferrat. The report of his departure had become known, and a great concourse of people was collected at the moment of his alighting from his carriage. Every countenance was dejected, and all were heard to mutter, "Is it possible that so great a man should be thus abandoned?" The emperor took leave of all the chasseurs of the picket which had accompanied him, and stepped into the boat of the Salle frigate, which had come to wait for him close to the castle. The boats of the Medusa received the orders, and every person of his suite quitted the shore with him on the 8th of July. At about the hour 4 in the afternoon, we arrived rather late on board the Salle, the wind being contrary and blowing with great violence. The Salle and the Medusa frigates were those which were appointed to convey us to America. There were in the same road 2 other ships of war which were placed at the prince's disposal, a brig and the corvette La Bayadere, the latter in the direction of the Gironde. The 2 frigates were quite new. The Medusa carried 18-pounders and had already made an excursion in which it was found to be very superior. The Salle was of a rather large class. Nevertheless, I could not affirm that it carried heavier guns than the 18-pounders. This was her first attempt at sailing, but all were agreed in opinion that she would also prove an excellent sailor. The crews of both were composed of old seamen who had returned from the prisons of England since the peace of 1814. During the 5 or 6 days which the emperor had passed in Rochefort, a small Danish vessel then in port had been prepared for sea and fully provisioned. A secret recess had even been contrived in it in the event of its being visited by the English cruisers. It was proposed to the emperor that he should proceed in this vessel to America, but he refused and declined running a risk which might be attended with unpleasant consequences. Nevertheless, he made the small vessel proceed into the road, reserving to himself the power of afterwards considering what course it might be most advantageous for him to adopt. Chapter 11. The emperor was on board ever since the 8th of July. We now had reached the 11th, and the passports announced to us were not yet arrived. Fouché had intimated that the English government would probably transmit them by the vessel cruising off Rochefort. We accordingly conceived that there could be no danger in proceeding to ascertain if they were on board. In any case, it could only be productive of advantage to us that we should reconnoiter the cruiser. The emperor was informed that some American vessels which had set sail had already dropped down to the entrance to the river of Bordeaux, and he sent a person to visit them. They were found to be 4 in number, and had near them a French corvette which was anchored at the mouth of the river. The reconnoitering was made at the same time that the emperor sent on board of the English cruiser. Monsieur de las Casas and I were sent by the emperor to be the bearers of his message. Monsieur de las Casas had a letter from General Bertrand for the Commodore on the station. The Grand Marshal apprised him that passports were to arrive from London for the Emperor, and accordingly inquired if they had reached him. We were instructed to afford the Commodore whatever explanation he might require in the event of his not having yet received any passports. Although Mr. de las Casas spoke English very fluently, it was agreed that he should feign ignorance of it. We were both dressed in plain frocks and carried no marks of distinction upon our persons. We quitted the Salle frigate on the 11th of July before daybreak to embark on board a small schooner and take advantage of the tide which was to carry us beyond the point of Chasseron at the extremity of the island of Oleron, where the English ship kept cruising. We arrived on board at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. The ship was named the Belle Bellerophon, and was under the command of Captain Maitland. The corvette which accompanied it was called the Myrmidon, and was under Captain Gambier's orders. Monsieur de las Casas handed to the captain of the Bellerophon the letter placed in his charge by General Bertrand. We acquainted him with what he was still ignorant of, that owing to a series of occurrences which had taken place since the Battle of Waterloo, the Emperor had abdicated and had come to Rochefort with the intention of proceeding to America. We told him that the provisional government of France had demanded passports from him from the General-in-Chief of the English army, who had referred the case to London, from whence they were to be forwarded to the cruiser stationed off Rochefort. Monsieur de las Casas observed to Captain Maitland that the Emperor, having altogether closed his political career, was desirous of quietly taking his departure without being obstructed by any opposition from English cruisers. This was the only reason that made him attach any value to the passports. He was anxious to prevent any engagement between the French frigates and any vessels they might fall in with. He observed that in the event there existed any difficulty on account of the frigates, the Emperor would renounce the comforts he found in them and take his departure on board of American vessels, which were on the point of quitting the Gironde, or else in the French trading vessels. Captain Maitland answered Monsieur de las Casas in the following words, which he spoke in the French language. I am quite ignorant of the details you communicate to me. I only know that the Battle of Waterloo had been won. I cannot therefore reply to the demand which is the object of your message, but if you will wait a few moments, I may perhaps learn something more on the subject, for I discover a corvette which is maneuvering to join me. It informs me by signals that it has just arrived from England and has letters for me. I shall maneuver on my side to accelerate her approach. In the meanwhile, let us go to breakfast. The captain of the corvette came on board the Bellerophon whilst we were at table, and handed to Captain Maitland all the dispatches which he had been directed to deliver to him. This corvette was called the Falmouth. It had, in fact, arrived from England and had passed by Quiberon Bay for the purpose of delivering dispatches to Admiral Hotham, who was in command of that station. Captain Maitland read his dispatches and said to us, "They do not contain a single word of what you have just communicated to me. I even find that at the moment of this vessel's departure, they were still ignorant in England of the facts you have mentioned. It could not be supposed that Admiral Hotham had received any instructions on the subject, for the corvette having proceeded to meet him previously to its making for Rochefort, he would no doubt have availed himself on this opportunity to issue to Captain Maitland the orders which would have been the necessary consequence of what he might have learned from England respecting the Emperor." During breakfast, Captain Maitland entered into conversation in the English language with the captain of the Falmouth corvette. Mr. de las Casas paid attention without pretending to understand it. Captain Maitland asked the officer of the Falmouth what news was stirring and where was the Emperor. He was told in reply that it was reported on board Admiral Hotham's ship that he had just arrived at Nantes and was creating a great stir there. Captain Maitland could not suppress a smile and said to us in French, "They know as little of the truth there as anywhere else." He then informed the captain of the Falmouth that the Emperor had just arrived at Rochefort. When breakfast was over and Captain Maitland had dismissed the officers who were with him, he resumed the conversation with us and requested we would have the goodness to repeat all that we had told him. We did so, and he replied us nearly the following words: "I should be happy to have it in my power to meet your wishes, but you see how impossible it is for me to comply with them. I shall immediately report to my admiral, who is in Quiberon Bay, that you have come on board my ship. I shall also send him General Bertrand his letter to me and acquaint you with the purport of his answer when I receive it, but I am of opinion that he will deem the matter of sufficient importance to proceed hither in person." We observed to Captain Maitland that such a course would be productive of delays, and the Emperor was most anxious to take his departure, to which he replied, "The matter does not depend upon me." We then put to him the following questions. The Emperor has no wish to conceal his departure. He can have no personal motive for doing so, as is clearly demonstrated by the step which he has directed us to take. But in the event of the wind turning fair previously to his receiving your answer, and of his taking advantage of it and setting out with his suite in the frigates or brigs, what course would you pursue? Instead of setting sail in those frigates, he were to put to sea in a French trading vessel, how would you act? And lastly, if instead of proceeding in the above vessels, he should sail out in a neutral vessel, an American ship, for instance, what would you do in that case? Captain Maitland replied as follows: if the Emperor sails out with the frigates, I will attack, and if possible, capture them. The Emperor would, in this case, become a prisoner. If he sails in a French trading vessel, as we are at war, I will capture it, and in this case also the Emperor would become a prisoner. If he sails in a neutral vessel, and I should search it, I will not take upon myself to suffer him to proceed. I will detain the vessel and refer the matter to my admiral, who will determine the question. It was then observed to him that in this case also he would no doubt make him a prisoner. Not at all, said Captain Maitland with warmth, but I will not take upon myself to decide the matter. This is a question of so extraordinary a nature that I shall leave the responsibility to my admiral. This explanation was followed by many details respecting the Emperor's position. Captain Maitland said to us in the course of conversation, the Emperor acts very properly in demanding passports in order to avoid misunderstandings which would be of daily occurrence at sea, but I do not think that our government would suffer him to proceed to America. Where then, said we to the Captain Maitland in return, would it be proposed to him that he should fix his residence? I am at a loss to form an idea on the subject, rejoined the captain, but I am almost certain of what I tell you. What repugnance could he feel in coming to England? He would thereby solve all difficulties? Monsieur de las Casas answered that we were not empowered to discuss this question, personally speaking, as he was of opinion that the Emperor had not entertained that idea, as he perhaps apprehended the effects of a resentment which was the natural consequence of the long misunderstanding subsisting between him and the English government. On the other hand, he had a predilection for mild climates and especially for social intercourse, both which advantages he might find in America without apprehending any harsh treatment from anyone. Captain Maitland replied that it was a mistake to suppose the English climate was damper and healthy. In some countries, the county of Kent, for instance, it was mild as in France. As to the enjoyments of his social life, they were incomparably superior in England to anything the Emperor might find in America. As for the resentments he might apprehend, said the captain, his coming to England would be the surest means of extinguishing them. Residing in the midst of the nation, placed under the protection of its laws, he would be protected from every danger and render the effects of his enemies altogether powerless. He observed that even if the ministers were to attempt to molest him, a circumstance which he doubted, they would not do so, because with us, he added, the government is not of an arbitrary character. It is obedient to the laws. I dare say, continued Captain Maitland, that the government will adopt towards him every measure of precaution calculated to secure his repose as well as that of the country where he may reside. Such precautions for existence as it adopted in respect to his brother Lucian, but I cannot imagine that any other course would be adopted because, as I repeat, ministers have no right to do so, and the nation would not suffer for it. Mr. de las Casas again observed to Captain Maitland that he was not empowered to discuss that subject, but he had not lost one word of his conversation and would report it to the Emperor. And if this prince should determine upon proceeding to England, he should let him know. He then put this question to him. In the event of the Emperor's adopting the idea of going to England, an idea which I shall do all in my power to promote, may he depend upon being admitted on board your ship, as well as those who accompany him, for such a supposition no longer admits of a passage on board the frigates. Captain Maitland replied that he would instantly address a dispatch to his admiral on the subject, but that if the Emperor should request a passage on board of his ship previously to his receiving a reply, he should at once admit him. After this conversation, which lasted a long time, Captain Maitland handed in his reply to the letter written to him by General Bertrand and promised us that if the expected passports should arrive, he would instantly apprise us of the fact. At any rate, he would come to anchor the day after tomorrow in Basque Roads, where they might communicate with him as much as they pleased. We took leave, Monsieur de las Casas and I, of Captain Maitland to return to the Emperor, who was on board the Salle in the road of the Lille decks. He reflected in the afternoon on the purport of the message we had brought back, sent for me during the night, was silent for a moment, and then said, Go and desire the captain of the frigate in my name to set sail immediately. I was aware of the precise tendency of the instructions which he had received from the minister. I went in full confidence to give him the order to set sail, but great was my surprise when Captain Philibert informed me that he had secret orders. He was strictly forbidden to carry his mission into effect if the vessels of the state ran any risk. All this, therefore, I said to him, is a mere deception. The only object intended by the commission of government was that the emperor should be placed under the necessity of delivering himself up to the enemy. I do not know, replied the captain, but I have orders to set sail. I returned in the utmost alarm and informed the emperor of the base snare that had been thrown in his way. My secret presentiments told me as much, said the emperor. I was unwilling to believe it, and felt a reluctance in suspecting that this captain, who appeared a very worthy man, should have lent himself to so shameful an act of treachery. What a villain is that Fouché! Nevertheless, amongst the persons who signed those odious instructions, there was one more guilty. Even more guilty than Fouché. The emperor, seeing him thus cowardly betrayed by men loaded with his favors, had no resource left but to resign himself to his fate. He landed the next morning, 12th of July, on the Lille decks, where he waited the return of General Lallemande, whom he had sent to examine the American vessels at the entrance of the Gironde. They afforded the means of reaching America, and even presented some prospect of doing so without great danger. The emperor was urged to avail himself of the opportunity. Nevertheless, he refused and told us that if on quitting France he still retained any afterthought in his mind, he would take his departure in an American vessel, but as he had frankly withdrawn himself forever from the bustle of a life of agitation, he did not see why he should not be allowed to run out his career unmolested and at a distance from intriguers and ungrateful men.